Good afternoon, everyone. This is Christopher Garabedian, the main lead of the capstone team that was able to work on the project, a continuation of the smartphone-based speech assessment. I worked with Mario Platias, Carla Gonzalez, Rosemary Martin Perez, and Soto Dominguez, Luis Miguel. All of us together were able to continue the work on this project that was done by a previous capstone group. So to just reintroduce the problem that this project was working on, we've been working with different capstone groups to make a mobile application to help users diagnose and learn about their own speech difficulties, such as things like Parkinson's, things such as Down syndrome related speech issues, and other related problems that may come from a diagnosis that instead of going to a doctor, we can use technology that has been around for a very long time now to help themselves. The intention of these tests is to detect speech irregularities through recordings, and they were saved locally with no feature to associate the audio files to unique users. Now, that specific issue is something that we will talk about later, but that is part of what we were able to work on with everybody in this group this semester. Things such as storing audio files to the backend and trying to get feature associated workings on those audio files to actually produce data and results that the users could read and read graphs that would tell them and help them understand what they are going through. The goal of this project was to develop new ways for users to create an account to log in, to have their audio files stored on a backend so that they don't have to worry about how much data that will be taken up on their mobile device. And to, of course, give data analysis, as I said earlier, on the recordings. The requirements are very similar to the last group's project. However, we included a bit more. So for the front end, this is what the actual code has been developed on to create the application itself. We used Flutter to create the mobile application, Android Studio to help with the implementation on Android devices, Visual Code Studio to, of course, run Flutter, and then GitHub and GitHub associated branches that we were able to share our code and, of course, upload it to our supervisors. The backend, of course, this is where most of the work was done this semester, specifically with Whisper, Pratt, and Labrosha. Those products are specifically used to evaluate the data on the backend, to evaluate the audio files on the backend, to print the data values that would be transferred into graphs for the users to therefore read and understand. IntelliJ IDE, that is what we use to run the server. MySQL Workbench, we use that to interact with the server and the tables that would be storing the audio files. Apache Tomcat is another part of the server aspect. And Postman was used to interact with the API that we had to get up and running on our own devices so that we could, of course, connect to the server. Implementations, this is what we were able to work on specifically. So the smartphone speech assessment application, this is what was developed on Flutter, has the following new implementations. It has a login page for account creation or signing in if you already have a pre-existing account. The information input on this page will link the audio recordings to this specific user. So if you have a mother or sister who wants to make an account and they want to do some tests, they can do their own tests. Meanwhile, you can have your own account and you can do your own tests, and they will be completely separate, linked to each other's respective accounts. Now, the ability to store audio to a MySQL server backend is what we were able to accomplish this semester. The audio is linked to the user that logged into the app and contains identification variables for the categorical storage. Now, the combination of speech-related Python, the combination of speech workings with the Python script that utilized Whisper, Labrosha, and Pratt are what we use to create these speech data values. These data values, of course, you see two tables here. One on the left is a UML diagram. Meanwhile, the one on the right is a sequence diagram. The UML diagram on the left here shows a lot of the variables that we were able to take from the last class while also introducing our own. So if you notice here on the test picker screen, that is, of course, just a field type. Info screen, we have doubles, very simple variables. If we move to the record and play screen, this is where a lot of the user interaction is actually accounted for. So the user clicks, there's widgets and noise meters to obviously display data and values that is being evaluated at that very moment that the user is recording and playing their own audio back to them if they wish to listen to it. File upload is a very simple. That is how we were able to send the audio to the backend. Meanwhile, speech metrics, these are specific variables that all were evaluated, and there are even more that we were not able to accomplish, but we'll get to that later in the shortcomings. However, this is a great example of how much data that we are able to pull from the audio files that are recorded and sent to the backend. They're all doubles, and all of these number values get translated to a graph, hopefully in the future, to be able to be displayed to the user. On the right, we simply have a very nice diagram that shows that the phone emulator, which is what we were practicing and working with, enables the test picker. You go from picking your test to then recording your test, and that would then therefore connect to the Koyo server database, which we were able to interact with MySQL Workbench. From there, the server connects to our local computer, which is what we were running these programs on, and running things such as Whisper to actually send data values, to obtain data values from the Koyo server that has the audio files in them. So here we can see this is the welcome screen that we were able to develop this semester. That is the one on the left. And then the one on the right is the login screen that follows right after you click login or sign up, respectively, whichever. Or you can sign up with a username and then a password for specifically this service, or you could just log in with Google or Apple. Other name brands can be included at another date, but as of right now, those are the two we have. And this is a mock-up of what the data tables I was referring to, or the graphs that I was referring to earlier, that could be created from the data values that we are able to extract from the audio files. So on the left, we have simply a graph that it takes in your information and it prints out accordingly to what the average is versus what yours is. So you can notice that the blue line may be your speech. Meanwhile, the yellow, the orange, and the gray line is are a few different averages of what it would normally be like in a normal case. Moving on to the second graph, this graph on the right is more of a over time graph. So let's say you take the test in March and you got a series of results that placed you in a certain position versus the national average, and then you take the test again in June. You can notice the change between where you were placed before and after with this time lapse. Maybe in between March and June, you got therapy, or maybe between March and June, something else changed. And then you could, of course, take another test in September or another date later, and you can notice the changes over time in your speech metrics. And of course, we want to, in the future, introduce a more friendly and understandable results presentation. But as of right now, this is what we were able to mock up as an example of what we would have liked to accomplish. One more thing that we were able to accomplish being the audio file storage on the MySQL server backend. So on the screen here, you may notice two red circles specifically referencing the pathing of the audio files. You may notice the top is some kind of code compiler output, and that is exactly what it is. It is the Flutter output of what we see printed as an audio path storing to the emulator that we were using. Meanwhile, the bottom one displays a red circle showing that the path in the MySQL server is also stored, and it is labeled Project Koyo Study Data appropriately because that is where it is stored on the MySQL Koyo server. These two links are incredibly similar. If you notice on the very far right of the top picture, 1404, that is the local time in military terms, and the date is right to the left of it, 726. This is a example that we used to display how we can notice the exact timing of when this was uploaded and how to find it in the MySQL server. Moving on, I would like to address the shortcomings and things we would have loved to accomplish this semester, but of course, due to the time constraint of summer, we weren't able to accomplish as much as we desired. So the login screen, while it does serve to take in data, it does not actually verify that data. So technically anybody could use it as of right now. That doesn't make much usage of it, but we do have it working and we do have it displaying a proper screen to the users. The data analysis of the audio in the backend was also a giant priority of ours, but we simply couldn't get it done because of how much setup required for the server locally. Excuse me, for how much data was stored Before we were able to put it on the back end, the audio was stored locally, but now that we were able to put it on the back end, that required a lot of setup for the server, and that took up a lot of our semester time. Moving on to the third and final bullet point, to generate and display the graphs. As we showed earlier, those were simply examples, but we would love to actually have created the graphs from scratch using the data provided from the audio pulling, from the audio files. I would then like to go to our final and last slide, the references. We, of course, used Flutter, as mentioned earlier. This is how we developed the actual speech app itself, and this is what the users would mostly be interacting with on their Apple phones or their Android phones. Whisper, Pratt, and Labrosia kind of come as a 3-pack because all 3 of those individually measured their own speech metrics and gave us different variable data types to then work on later within the results. Work on later as in making result data graphs that could be shown to the user. MySQL, of course, Postman, both of those referring to the backend setup and how much we had to pull from servers, mess with the APIs so that we could properly get what we needed to store the audio on the backend. GitHub, this link is to the GitHub that is going to be storing our code this semester, and it is what we used to pull from last semester's code. Retrofit is a new reference from comparative to the last semester's group. It was used to create a lot of the API functionality within Flutter itself. The FIU Mobile Sensing Lab is another example that we pulled from the product owners. They gave us a wonderful reference to use and help us with but to help us develop the backend further. And Firebase is how we were able to run a mock backend for experimenting earlier in the semester with things like how to get the login to connect to the backend and store user data, such as things like that. We were able to experiment a little bit thanks to the Firebase reference. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening in, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.